Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today in this video we're going to look at building API management APIs that can sit in front of logic apps. We're going to build the API with Terraform. Today we're going to look at consumption logic apps. We're going to do another video which will look in more detail at standards. So quick look at the diagram that we're going to talk about. So here you can see we've got a resource group, I've got API management, and I've got a caller who makes calls into my API. And then depending on what operation they call, sometimes I'll have it call out to a logic app standard. So if you notice here in the diagram, we could have two different apps on an app service which contain workflows for different logic apps. So some calls will go to one logic app, some might go to another, and then other calls might go down to a consumption logic app. So the question that we're going to have today is, how do we build this API here? And then with Terraform, we're going to look at this particular workflow here. So how do we expose that consumption logic app into... So in the Terraform solution I've got here, you can see we've got kind of a few different files. I've got my main.tf here, which would let me configure the Terraform provider. The providers I'm using in this file here, you can see we've got Azure RM and we've got AZ API. So the key one here, we're going to use both, but the key ones, AZ API will let us do some stuff to be able to get to the logic app we need. Okay, so how this works then is up in the modules, sorry, in the wrong bit. In the modules up here, I've created a logic app consumption module, and a Terraform module is going to allow me to create some reusable provider resources that'll make it easier to add my logic apps. So we've got in the variables file here, you can see we've got some variables for the things we need. So we need a logic app name, logic app resource group, APIIM resource group, the name of the API instance, and the name of the API that we're going to add the logic apps to. We then have the providers file over here, which lets us configure which providers that we need, so we can configure the AZ API and the Azure RM provider. And then the main bit of work that we're going to do is this file here. So this is going to tell us how we're going to build this API. And then in a minute, I'm going to show how we call to set this API up that we're going to build. So there's a couple of things we're going to do. So this first bit here is going to is like a data element. So this is going to be like a read of the Azure resource group that the logic app lives in. This one's a read of the resource group APIIM lives in, so we'll be able to reference those later on. Here we've got a read of the logic app itself. So in consumption, we've got the name and the parent ID. It's the name of the logic app, and the parent ID would be the resource group that it's going to live in. This will basically read that resource and give us access to the values. And then down here we've got this AZ API resource action, which I've given it a name. So this is the name of this particular object in Terraform. So this is going to be the logic app callback URL. So what will happen is when we run Terraform, this bit here is going to go out and make a call to the management API on Azure, and it'll execute this operation here, which will get the callback URL for that logic app. So when you provide the resource ID here, it's telling it which resource you're gonna connect to, and then your actions, basically what API operation are you going to execute against it. So this will give me a JSON object back that will show me the logic app's details, and in particular this callback URL. So if we scroll a little bit further down here, we can have a look what we're doing next. So at this point, we've got the logic app URL. So here, here we're going to create the backend in APIM. So we've got this resource of type API Management Backend, and then this bit here is the name that references this object, so I can reference it in my Terraform elsewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to point to our API management instance, and we're going to create a new backend where the name matches the name of the logic app, which is what that'll give it here. We're then going to, the rest of the settings are pretty explanatory, but the URL, we're going to do a JSON decode of the callback URL's JSON. So that's where we reference the data element. That was this one up here. We're telling it what type and the name of it, which is this bit matches that up here. And then we're going to get the output property. So that'll get the JSON object that we got back in the previous element in the Terraform. And then it'll have a property called base path, which will set the backend URL for this API. And then here we're going to specify the credentials for that logic apps. This is where we need to specify the query parameters for things like the signature, the API version. And here all we're doing is we're referencing back to this Terraform object and telling it to use these properties from that Terraform object to specify the credentials for calling that logic app. So that'll give us that API management backend. We can now use that backend in any of our APIM policies. And then if we scroll just a little bit further down, you can see here, this is where we build the API operation. So we've got an APIM operation, and then we have here we're specifying things like the API management instance. We're going to give the operation an ID. So here I'm just referencing the name of the logic app from that earlier Terraform object, and I'm just going to do a post on the end of it. Here we've got the name for the API that this operation is going to be added to. So this is where this reusable module that I'm building in Terraform, I'm going to call it multiple times. And each time I call it, I'll just pass the variable for the name of the API I want to add this logic app to. Now, here we've got a display name, so I'm just going to use the name of the logic app. I'm going to give it a method of post, and then the URL that I expose to the caller of APIM. You could pass in a variable if you wanted, or in this case, I've just configured logic apps, and then the name of the logic app itself that'll appear in this APIM operation. And you can see here, I'm just passing in, fairly generic request and response. I could do something with them if I wanted to take this further. And then the final bit is the APIM policy. So on this API, we've got a Terraform object for APIM policy. When we reference the operation ID, we're really pointing to this Terraform object that we've created above. We have to tell it the name of the API management instance, the name of the API, and other properties. But the key bit this time is the policy here. So I'm injecting in this policy, and then I'm using the set backend policy here, where I'm using the name of the Terraform object we created much earlier on, where we've specified the backend. So we're just saying use that backend. You need the rewrite to be back to the base path. So when the call comes into this API, that's going to then forward it to the logic app. The backend will inject the credentials and the query string, and that'll execute on the logic app itself. So now we've got this reusable module in Terraform. So how do we actually use that? So if we go and look at this consumption file over here, and we'll talk about how I can now use that module repeatedly to create lots of logic apps. Lots of API operations that point to consumption logic apps. So here I've defined a locals sort of map object in Terraform. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a list of logic app consumption objects, and these basically have these two properties. So I've got what's the name of the logic app, what's the resource script for it, and then I could basically put another one here and just add more and more to this array, and this would go and create an operation for every logic app in this array. Now, where these would be used is I've got this call to my module down here, so you can see I've passed in the path for my module that creates an API operation. I'm using a count, which basically loops back to this object here, which will make it execute my module once for each item in this array of consumption logic apps. And then I'm specifying here the properties for calling my reusable module. So I'm saying here's the name of the logic app, here's the resource group, here's the name of the API, here's the resource group for APIM. And now in my case, these are these API ones, they're fairly static, and the bits I've made dynamic are the bits about which logic app it is. But you could equally put extra properties in that logic app consumption list array, and pass in different APIs if you wanted to. One of the things for your module, you also need to pass in your references for the providers it's going to use. So if you look in the wider Terraform solution, which I'll not get into too much here, we've got things like the providers file over here, where I'm specifying a few extra things. Things like the APIM file here, I've actually built the API itself first. So what I do is, if you imagine I build the API, then it calls this list, and it actually passes the name of that API here. And then it'll add one logic app to it for each, one operation for each logic app. So next up, if we have a look at, sorry, just bear with me a second. So we have a look at our APIM over here now. So you can see in API management, here I've got a demo logic app that I've created from Terraform. So it's added, and we'll talk about this one, the standard one, in the next video, but we've created one for this consumption logic app. And then here you can see in the policy, in the policy here you can see the policy we passed in from Terraform. So we've said here's our backend, so the name of the logic app we're going to call. And then if we look over in the backends over here, just get rid of that text off there. So in the backends over here, our demo logic app, you can see, we've got this configured. You can see the URL for it up here. And then if we went into the credentials, you would see on the query string we've got some of the details over here about what the details for calling that logic app are. So this gives us, everything's now configured. We can call our APIM and it'll forward on to the consumption logic app. And I'm just going to give this a quick test. Don't think I need to put any property in, any body here. So you can see we've got a 202 accepted back from there. You can see down the bottom here, you can see we've got some of the headers back from the logic app, so I know which run it was and a few other things. So, ideally what I wanted to show in today's video was how, using this module we've got for consumption logic apps, all the complexities hidden in this reusable module. All I have to do here is basically create a list of logic apps here that I want to expose, and then do a loop over it, and it'll call my module, and it'll create one operation on whichever API I point it to for each logic app. So that makes it really easy for us to expose logic app consumption via API management. Thank you for listening to today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. I know a few other people have been talking about exposing callback URLs. So I think it was Andrew did one about Bicep. Go and check that out. Really good article. It doesn't really matter which technology you use, and the fact that you're doing good infrastructure as code's important, and you're doing good DevOps processes. But hopefully these two ideas will show you the way you can do it with Terraform and with the two different flavors of logic apps. Have a great week.